好，今日又到讀你聽嘅時間啦。咁今日咧就讀到第9節故事嘅第9節 450 from Paddington 有我哋偉大嘅作家A.Christie 嘅作品之一。呢個作品其實我想講係如果喺網上睇咧，佢唔算係備受推薦嘅10大或者15大都不入嘅佢唔係名列前茅嘅作品。咁比較小眾啲啦，呢一個相對嚟講啦咁但係我自己都幾滿意嘅，對於佢嗰個敘事同埋佢嗰個 setting， 我目前嚟講都覺得幾引人入勝嘅，係不錯。咁故事發展到咧就係都係 Emma 啦露出咗啲破綻啦，即係當佢嘅事務律師同佢講，家庭律師同佢講話呢個女死者係一個外國人，佢就好大反應啦，就話咦，佢係咪法國人啊咁樣。咁有啲大意啦，係嘛？咁作為兇手就一定係好大意啦。咁但係如果佢真係一個咁精明嘅兇手，佢理論上真係唔會露出咁大嘅破綻咯。咁作者會唔會係嘗試緊引導讀者去以為 Emma 就係兇手咧？我而家有偏向有啲咁諗啦，咁樣。但 anyway， 我哋繼續睇一睇故事嘅發展啦。明顯都係圍繞住 Craddock 呢家人，因為佢哋全部都係嫌疑犯嚟嘅，冇人有洗脫罪名嘅。咁樣好，我哋睇下 Chapter 9啦。The only people who really did justice to Lucy's excellent lunch were the two boys and Cedric Craddock, who appeared completely unaffected by the circumstances which had caused him to return to England. He seemed, indeed, to regard the whole thing as a rather good joke of a macabre nature. This attitude, Lucy noted, was most unpalatable to his brother Harold. Harold seemed to take the murder as a kind of personal insult to the Craddock family, and so great was his sense of outrage that he ate hardly any lunch. Emma looked worried and unhappy and also ate very little. Alfred seemed lost in a train of thought of his own and spoke very little. He was quite a good-looking man, with a thin, dark face and eyes set rather too close together. After lunch, the police officers returned and politely asked if they could have a few words with Mr. Cedric Hackenthorpe. Inspector Craddock was very pleasant and friendly. "Sit down, Mr. Craddock. I understand you have just come back from the Balearics. Balearics. You live out there. Have done for the past 6 years, in Ibiza. Suits me better than this dreary country. You get a good deal more sunshine than we do, I expect," said Inspector Craddock agreeably. "You were home not so very long ago, I understand, for Christmas to be exact. What made it necessary for you to come back again so soon?" Cedric grinned. "Got a wire from Emma, my sister. We've never had a murder on the premise before. Didn't want to miss anything, so along I came." "You are interested in criminology?" "Oh, we needn't put it in such highbrow terms. I just like murders, whodunits and all that. With a whodunit parked right up the family doorstep, it seemed the chance of a lifetime. Besides, I thought poor M might need a spot of help, managing the old man and the police and all the rest of it." "I see. It appealed to your sporting instincts and also to your family feelings. I have no doubt your sister will be very grateful to you, although her 2 other brothers have also come to be with her." "But not to cheer and comfort," Cedric told him. "Harold is terrifically put out. It's not at all the thing for a city magnate to be mixed up with the murder of a questionable female." Craddock's eyebrows rose gently. "Was she a questionable female?" "Well, you're the authority on that point. Going by the facts, it seemed to me likely. I thought perhaps you might have been able to make a guess at who she was." "Come now, Inspector, you already know. Or your colleagues will tell you that I haven't been able to identify her." "I said a guess, Mr. Craddock. You might never have seen the woman before, but you might have been able to make a guess at who she was. or who she might have been? Cedric shook his head. You're barking up the wrong tree. I've absolutely no idea. You're suggesting, I suppose, that she may have come to the long barn to keep an explanation with one of us? But none of us live here. The only people in the house were a woman and an old man. You don't seriously believe that she came here to keep a date with my revered pop? Our point is, Inspector Bacon agrees with me that the woman may once have had some association with this house. It may have been a considerable number of years ago. Cast your mind back, Mr. Crackenthorpe. Cedric thought a moment or two, then shook his head. We've had foreign help from time to time, like most people, but I can't think of any likely possibility. Better ask the others. They know more than I would. We shall do that, of course. Craddock leaned back in his chair and went on. As you have heard at the inquest, the medical evidence cannot fix the time of death very accurately. Longer than 2 weeks, less than 4, which brings it somewhere around Christmas time. You have told me you came home for Christmas. When did you arrive in England and when did you leave? Cedric reflected. Let me see. I flew. Got here on a Saturday before Christmas. That would be the 21st. You flew straight from Mallorca? Yes, left at 5 in the morning and got here midday. And you left. I flew back on the following Friday, the 27th. Thank you, Cedric grinned. Leaves me well within the limit, unfortunately. But really, Inspector, strangling young women is not my favorite form of Christmas fun. I hope not, Mr. Crackenthorpe. Inspector Bacon merely looked disapproving. There would be a remarkable absence of peace and goodwill about such an action, don't you agree? Cedric addressed this question to Inspector Bacon, who merely grunted. Inspector Craddock said politely, Well, thank you, Mr. Crackenthorpe. That will be all. And what do you think of him? Craddock asked as Cedric shut the door behind him. Bacon grunted again. Cocky enough for anything, he said. I don't care for the type myself. A loose-living lot, these artists, and very likely to be mixed up with a disreputable class of women. Craddock smiled. I don't like the way he dresses either, went on Bacon. No respect. Going to an inquest like that. Dirtiest pair of trousers I've seen in a long time. And did you see his tie? Looked as though it was made of colored string. If you ask me, he's the kind that would easily strangle a woman and make no bones about it. Well, he didn't strangle this one, if he didn't leave Mallorca until the 21st, and that's a thing we can verify easily enough. Bacon threw him a sharp glance. I noticed that you're not tipping your hand yet about the actual date of the crime. No, we'll keep that dark for the present. I always like to have something up my sleeve in the early stages. Bacon nodded in full agreement. Springing on them when the time comes, he said. That's the best plan. And now, said Craddock, we'll see what our correct city gentleman has to say about it all. Harold Crackenthorpe, thin-lipped, had very little to say about it. It was most distasteful, a very unfortunate incident. The newspapers, he was afraid, reporters, he understood, had already been asking for interviews, all that sort of thing. Most regrettable. Harold's staccato, unfinished sentences ended. He leaned back in his chair with the expression of a man confronted with a very bad smell. The inspector's probing produced no result. No, he had no idea who the woman was or could be. Yes, he had been at Rutherford Hall for Christmas. He had been unable to come down until Christmas Eve, but had stayed on over the following weekend. That's that, then, said Inspector Craddock, without pressing his questions further. He had already made up his mind that Harold Crackenthorpe was not going to be helpful. He passed on to Alfred, who came into the room with a nonchalance that seemed just a trifle overdone. Craddock looked at Alfred Crackenthorpe with a faint feeling of recognition. Surely he had seen this particular member of the family somewhere before, or had it been this picture on the paper? There was something discreditable attached to the memory. He asked Alfred his occupation, and Alfred's answer was fake. I'm in insurance at the moment. Until recently, I've been interested in putting a new type of talking machine in the market. Quite revolutionary. I did very well out of that, as a matter of fact. Inspector Craddock looked appreciative, and no one could have had the least idea what he was noticing that superficially smart appearance of Everett's suit and gauging correctly the low price it had cost. Cedric's clothes had been disreputable, almost threadbare, but they had been originally of good cut and excellent material. Here there was a cheap smartness that told its own tale. Craddock passed pleasantly on to his routine questions. Everett seemed interested, even slightly amused. It's quite an idea that the woman might once have had a job here, not as a lady's maid. I doubt if my sister has ever had such a thing. I don't think anyone has nowadays. But, of course, there is a good deal of foreign domestic labor floating about. We've had Poles and a temperamental German or two. As Emma definitely didn't recognize the woman, I think that washes your idea out, Inspector. Emma's got a very good memory for a face. No, if the woman came from London... What gives you the idea she came from London, by the way? He slipped the question in quite casually, but his eyes were sharp and interested. Inspector Craddock smiled and shook his head. Alfred looked at him keenly. Not telling, eh? Return ticket in her coat pocket, perhaps. Is that it? It could be, Mr. Crackenthorpe. Well, granting she came from London, perhaps the chap she came to meet had the idea that the Long Barn would be a nice place to do a quiet murder. He knows the setup there, the setup here, evidently. I should go looking for him if I were you, Inspector. We are, said Inspector Craddock, and made the two little words sound quiet and confident. He thanked Alfred and dismissed him. You know, he said to Bacon, I've seen that chap somewhere before. Inspector Bacon gave his verdict. Sharp customer, he said, so sharp that he cuts himself sometimes. I don't suppose you want to see me, said Brian Easley apologetically, coming into the room and hesitating by the door. I don't exactly belong to the family. Let me see, you are Mr. Brian Easley, the husband of Miss Edith Crackenthorpe, who died 5 years ago. That's right. Well, it's very kind of you, Mr. Easley, especially if you know something that you think you could assist us in some way. But I don't. I wish I did. Whole thing seems so ruddy peculiar, doesn't it? Coming along and meeting some fellow in that draughty old barn in the middle of winter wouldn't be my cup of tea. It is certainly very perplexing, Inspector Craddock agreed. Is it true that she was a foreigner? Word seems to have got round to that effect. Does that fact suggest anything to you? The inspector looked at him sharply, but Brian seemed amiably vacuous. No, it doesn't, as a matter of fact. Maybe she was French, said Inspector Bacon, with dark suspicion. Brian was roused to slight animation. A look of interest came into his blue eyes, and he tugged at his big, fair moustache. Really, Guy Paris? He shook his head. On the whole, it seems to make it even more unlikely, doesn't it? Messing about in the barn, I mean. You haven't had any other sarcophagus murders, have you? One of these fellows with an urge or a complex thinks he's Caligula or someone like that. Inspector Craddock did not even trouble to reject his speculation. Instead, he asked in a casual manner, Nobody in the family got any French connections or relationships that you know of? Brian said that the Crackenthorpes weren't a very gay lot. Harold's respectably married, he said, a fish-faced woman, some impoverished peer's daughter. Don't think Alfred cares about women much. Spends his life going in for shady deals which usually go wrong in the end. I dare say Cedric's got a few Spanish senoritas jumping through hoops for him in Ibiza. Women rather fall for Cedric. Doesn't always shave and looks as though he never washes. Don't see why that should be attractive to women, but apparently it is, I say. I'm not being very helpful, am I? He grinned at them. Better get young Alexander on the job. He and James thought that West are out hunting for clues in a big way. Bet you they turn up something. Inspector Craddock said he hoped they would. Then he thanked Brian Easley and said he would like to speak to Miss Emma Crackenthorpe. Inspector Craddock looked with more attention at Emma Crackenthorpe than he had done previously. He was still wondering about the expression that he had surprised on her face before lunch. A quiet woman, not stupid, not brilliant either. One of those comfortable, pleasant women whose men were inclined to take for granted, and who had the art of making a house into a home, giving it an atmosphere of restfulness and quiet harmony. Such, he thought, was Emma Crackenthorpe. Women such as this were often underrated. Behind their quiet exterior, they had force of character. They were to be reckoned with. Perhaps Craddock thought the clue to the mystery of the dead woman in the sarcophagus was hidden away in the recesses of Emma's mind. Whilst these thoughts were passing through his head, Craddock was asking various unimportant questions. "I don't suppose there is much that you haven't already told Inspector Bacon," he said, "so I needn't worry you with many questions. Please ask me anything you like." "As Mr. Wimborne told you, we have reached the conclusion that the dead woman was not a native of these parts. That may be a relief to you. Mr. Wimborne seemed to think it would be, but it seems it really more difficult for us. She's less easily identified." "But didn't she have anything? A handbag, papers?" Craddock shook his head. "No handbag, nothing in her pockets." "You have no idea of her name or where she came from? Anything at all?" Craddock thought to himself, she wants to know. She's very anxious to know who the woman was. Has she felt like that all along, I wonder? Bacon didn't give me that impression, and he's a shrewd man. "We know nothing about her," he said. "That's why we hope one of you could help us. Are you sure you can't? Even if you didn't recognize her, can you think of anyone she might be?" He thought, but perhaps he imagined it, that there was a very slight pause before she answered. "I have absolutely no idea," she said. Imperceptibly, Inspector Craddock's manner changed. It was hardly noticeable except as a slight hardness in his voice. "When Mr. Wimborne told you that the woman was a foreigner, why did you assume that she was French?" Emma was not disconcerted. Her eyebrows rose slightly. "Did I? Yes, I believe I did. I don't really know why, except that one always tends to think foreigners are French until one finds out what nationality they really are. Most foreigners in this country are French, aren't they?" "Oh, I really wouldn't say that was so, Miss Crackenthorpe. Not nowadays. We have so many nationalities over here. Italians, Germans, Austrians, all the Scandinavian countries. Yes, I suppose you're right. You don't have some special reason for thinking that this woman was likely to be French?" She didn't hurry to deny it. She just thought a moment and then shook her head almost regretfully. "No," she said, "I really don't think so." Her glance met his placidly without flinching. Craddock looked towards Inspector Bacon. The latter leaned forward and presented a small animal powder compact. "Do you recognize this, Miss Crackenthorpe?" She took it and examined it. "No, it's certainly not mine." "You've no idea to whom it belonged?" "No." "Then I don't think we need worry you any more, for the present. Thank you." She smiled briefly at them, got up, and left the room. Again, he may have imagined it, but Craddock thought she moved rather quickly, as though a certain relief hurried her. "Think she knows something?" asked Bacon. Inspector Craddock said ruefully, At a certain stage, one is inclined to think everyone knows a little more than they are willing to tell you." "They usually do too," said Bacon out of the depth of his experience. "Only," he added, "it quite often isn't anything to do with the business in hand. It's some family peccadillo or some silly scrape that people are afraid is going to be dragged into the open." "Yes, I know. Well, at least." But whatever Inspector Craddock had been about to say never got said, for the door was flung open and old Mr. Crackenthorpe shovelled in a high state of indignation. "A pretty pass when Scotland Yard comes down and doesn't have the courtesy to talk to the head of the family first. Who's the master of his house, I'd like to know? Answer me that. Who's the master here?" "You are, of course, Mr. Crackenthorpe," said Craddock soothingly, and rising he spoke. "But we understood that you had already told Inspector Bacon all you know, and that your health not being good, we must not make too many demands upon it. Dr. Quimper said, I dare say, I'm not a strong man. As for Dr. Quimper, He's a regular old woman, perfectly good doctor, understand my case, but inclined to wrap me up in the cotton wool. Got a bee in his bonnet about food. Ran on at me Christmas time when I had a bit of a turn. What did I eat? When? Who cooked it? Who served it? Fuss, fuss, fuss. But though I may have indifferent health, I'm well enough to give you all the help that's in my power. Murder in my own house, or at any rate at my own barn. Interesting building that, Elizabethan. Local architect says not, but fellow doesn't know what he's talking about. Not a day later than 1580. But that's not what we're talking about. What do you want to know? What's your present theory? It's a little too early for theories, Mr. Crackenthorpe. We are still trying to find out who the woman was. Foreigner, you say? We think so. Enemy agent? Unlikely, I should say. You'd say. They're everywhere, these people. Infiltrating. Why the Home Office lets them in beats me. Spying on industrial secrets, I bet. That's what she was doing. In Brackhampton? Factories everywhere. One outside my own back gate. Craddock shot an inquiring glance at Bacon, who responded, metal boxes. How do you know that's what they're really making? Can't swallow all these fellows tell you. All right, if she wasn't a spy, who do you think she was? Think she was mixed up with one of my precious sons? It would be Alfred, if so. Not Harold, he's too careful, and Cedric doesn't condescend to live in this country. All right then, she was Alfred's bit of skirt, and some violent fellow followed her down here, thinking she was coming to meet him and did her in. How's that? Inspector Craddock said diplomatically that it was certainly a theory, but Mr. Alfred Crackenthorpe, he said, had not recognized her. Pah! Afraid, that's all. Alfred always was a coward, but he's a liar, remember. Always was. Lie himself black in the face. None of my sons are any good. Crowd of vultures waiting for me to die. That's their real occupation in life, he chuckled. And they can wait. I won't die to oblige them. Well, if that's all I can do for you, I'm tired. Got to rest. He shuffled out again. Alfred's bit of skirt? Said Bacon questioningly. In my opinion, the old man just made that up. He paused, hesitated. I think, personally, Alfred's quite all right. Perhaps a shifty customer in some ways, but not our present cup of tea. Mind you, I did just wonder about that Air Force chap. Brian Easley? Yes, I've run into one or two of his type. They're what you might call adrift in the world. Had danger and death and excitement too early in life. Now they find life tame. Tame and unsatisfactory. In a way, we've given them a raw deal, though I don't really know what we could do about it. But there they are, all past and no future, so to speak, and they're the kind that don't mind taking chances. The ordinary fellow plays safe by instinct. It's not so much morality as prudence, but these fellows aren't afraid. Playing safe isn't really in their vocabulary. If Easley were mixed up with a woman and wanted to kill her, he stopped, threw out a hand hopelessly. But why should he want to kill her? And if you do kill a woman, why plant her in your father-in-law's sarcophagus? No, if you ask me, none of this lot had anything to do with the murder. If they had, they wouldn't have gone to all the trouble of planting the body on their own back doorstep, so to speak. Craddock agreed that hardly made sense. Anything more you want to do here? Craddock said there wasn't. Bacon suggested coming back to Brackhampton and having a cup of tea, but Inspector Craddock said he was going to call on an old acquaintance. 咁好多證供啦見到咁有細緻啲描寫嘅就係Cedric 啦、Beasley 啦，同埋最尾亂入嘅Mr. Crackenthorpe 啦，咁自爆好多料出嚟啦。反而 Harold 嘅證供就冇乜點講 ，Emma 都有講嘅，但係 Emma 似乎即係比較 defensive 啲啦，冇透露好多嘢，同 Harold 差唔多。咁但係呢一個推理咧，就肯定係已經開始咗㗎啦。咁呢兩個 inspector 亦都各自有佢哋嘅 思路啦，亦都有各自佢哋嘅推測啦。咁呢一刻就甚至乎佢哋嘅結論係會唔會係呢一班所有 Craddock 都唔係兇手咧？因為既然如果佢哋兇手，點解要將個屍體擺翻喺自己嘅莊園入面咧？點解要擺喺自己後花園咧？So to speak 嚇，咁咪好傻？咁唔通係咁樣做係有其他嘅目的，係想俾人發現定係點咧？呢一刻我都稍為有啲保留啦。咁就再睇下事態發展啦，好嘛？咁好啦，臨離開之前就同大家分享幾個字啦。第一個字 macabre 意思係一個佢個法文字嚟嘅本身嚇。咁佢嘅意思就係因為懼怕死亡而感到嘅不安嚇。佢係一種不安啦。一種面對死亡嘅一種不安情緒咧，係都一個黑暗嘅字啊，可以咁講。macabre。magnate 就係形容一啲具一啲重量級人馬啊，一啲好有錢嘅好具有影響力嘅人啦，一啲巨頭富商啊，一啲有頭有面有身份嘅人啦 ，magnate。仲有就係 Balearic 或者如果讀清楚啲就 Balearic， 應該就 Balearic 就算噶啦。Balearic 中文就係巴里亞里群島啊。呢啲巴里亞里群島喺邊度咧？佢就係位於西班牙嘅東邊，咁就喺地中海入面嘅一個群島嚟嘅。咁當中有Palma 島啦，最比較大嘅最主要呢個群島最主要嘅島嶼就係 Palma 島啦。咁其中之個細島上面咧就有一個小城啦，就係 Ibiza 啦。咁喺90年代嗰陣時候咧 Ibiza 係一個非常之受英國人歡迎嘅度假勝地啦，就係去揈頭啦，去 rave 啦咁啦，一個咁樣嘅地方啦。咁今時今日 Ibiza 又變成點咧？因為呢個旅遊浪潮就肯定係過去式㗎啦。不過即係而家變成點咧，我都唔知，因為我自己冇去過。Balearic， 巴里亞里群島喺西班牙東邊嘅。咁就係咁先啦，3個字啦。好啦，咁就我哋下一次，今次到第幾回話？係第9回。咁我哋下次第10回再同大家見面啦。拜拜。到讀你聽嘅時間，今日繼續讀 A.Christie 嘅 450 from Paddington， 一個火車離奇謀殺案啊！嚟到第10節，咁上一回咧就講到即係幾個嫌疑人啦，都先後落咗口供啦。咁主要就係呢個 Craddock 嘅第2代啦，呢一刻嘅第2代，在生嘅第2代啦。咁就幾兄弟妹啦，咁就錄完口供之後咧。呢一個 Inspector Chief 咧，呢個 Craddock 咧，佢就講咗佢比較懷疑嘅人物，就係呢個女婿Craddock 嘅女婿Brian Easley。OK， 佢覺得佢嘅佢嘅出身啦佢嘅設定啦就比較符合嘅，因為佢係當過兵嘅，當完兵嘅無聊。咁尋求刺激呢啲咁樣嘅原因嘅，有啲咁嘅動機論比較上。咁就之後又點咧？之後咧就去到上一節尾咧，就呢個 Craddock 咧就話佢會揾一揾佢一個舊相識咁揾呢個舊相識就當然係去協助佢查呢一單案啦。 咁就如果揾到一個有力嘅幫手呢，咁當然亦都會推動呢個案件嘅推理啦，咁又會帶嚟啲新嘅衝擊啦，咁樣。咁唔知大家會唔會覺得呢一刻係同 Craddock 嘅猜測係一樣啦？咁樣，我自己就覺得咧，同呢個 Emma 咧就一定離唔開關係嘅啦。就算唔係 Emma 佢自己，一定都係 Emma 好親密嘅人嚇咁樣。咁啊，繼續啦 ，Chapter 10 Miss Marple sitting erect against a background of china dogs and presents from Margate, smiled approvingly at Inspector Dermot Craddock. "I'm so glad," she said, "that you have been assigned to the case. I hoped you would be." "When I got your letter," said Craddock, "I took it straight to the AC. As it happened, he had just heard from the Paddington people calling us in. They seemed to think it wasn't a local crime. The AC was very interested in what I had to tell him about you. He'd heard about you, I gather, from my godfather. Dear Sir Henry," murmured Miss Marple affectionately. "He got me to tell him all about the little Paddock's business. Do you want to hear what he said next? Please tell me if it is not a breach of confidence. He said, well, as this seems a completely cockeyed business, all thought up by a couple of old ladies who've turned out, against all probability, to be right. And since you already know one of these old ladies, I'm sending you down on the case. So here I am. And now, my dear Miss Marple, where do we go from here? This is not, as you probably appreciate, an official visit. I haven't got my henchman with me, and I thought you and I might take down our back hair together first." Miss Marple smiled at him. "I'm sure," she said, "that no one who only knows you officially would ever guess that you could be so human, and better looking than ever. Don't blush. Now, what exactly have you been told so far?" "I've got everything, I think. Your friend, Mrs. McGillicuddy's original statement to the police at St. Mary Mead, confirmation of a statement by the ticket collector, and also the note to the station master at Brackhampton. I may say that all the proper inquiries were made by the people concerned, the railway people and the police. But there is no doubt that you outsmarted them all by a most fantastic process of guesswork." "Not guesswork," said Miss Marple, "and I had a great advantage. I knew Elspeth McGillicuddy. Nobody else did. There was no obvious confirmation of her story. If there was no question of any woman being reported missing, then quite naturally they would think it was just an elderly lady imagining things, as elderly ladies often do, but not Elspeth McGillicuddy." "Not Elspeth McGillicuddy," agreed the inspector. "I'm looking forward to meeting her, you know. I wish she hadn't gone to Ceylon. We've arranging for her to be interviewed there, by the way. My own process of reasoning was not really original," said Miss Marple. "It's all in Mark Twain, the boy who found the horse. He just imagined where he would go if he were a horse, and he went there, and there was the horse." "You imagine that you would do if you were a cruel and cold-blooded murderer?" said Craddock, looking thoughtfully at Miss Marple's pink and white elderly fragility. "Really, your mind—" "Like a sink, my nephew Raymond used to say," Miss Marple agreed, nodding her head briskly. "But as I always told him, sinks are necessary domestic equipment and actually very hygienic. Can you go a little further still, put yourself in the murderer's place, and tell me just where he is now?" Miss Marple sighed. "I wish I could. I have no idea at all. But he must be someone who has lived in or knows all about Rutherford Hall." "I agree. But that opens up a very wide field. Quite a succession of daily women have worked there. There's the Women's Institute and the ARP wardens before them. They all know the long barn and the sarcophagus and where the key was kept. The whole setup there is widely known locally. Anybody living round about might hit on it as a good spot for his purpose." "Yes, indeed, I quite understand your difficulties." Craddock said, "We've never get anywhere until we identify the body.
And that, too, may be difficult. Oh, we'll get there in the end. We're checking up on all the reported disappearance of a woman of that age and appearance. There's no one outstanding who fits the bill. The MO puts her down as about 35, healthy, probably a married woman, has had at least one child. Her fur coat is a cheap one, purchased at a London store. Hundreds of such coats were sold in the last 3 months, about 60% of them to blonde women. No salesgirl can recognize the photograph of the dead woman, or is likely to if the purchase were made just before Christmas. Her other clothes seem mainly of foreign manufacture, mostly purchased in Paris. There are no English laundry marks. We're communicated with Paris and they are checking up there for us. Sooner or later, of course, someone will come forward with a missing relative or lodger. It's just a matter of time. The compact wasn't any help? Unfortunately, no. It's a type sold by the 100 in the Rue de Rivoli. Quite cheap. By the way, you ought to have turned that over to the police at once, or rather, Miss Islesbarrow should have done so. Miss Marple shook her head. But at that moment, there wasn't any question of a crime having been committed, she pointed out. If a young lady, practicing golf shots, picks up an old compact of no particular value in the long grass, surely she doesn't rush straight off to the police with it? Miss Marple paused, and then added firmly, I thought it much wiser to find the body first. Inspector Craddock was tickled. You don't seem ever to have had any doubts but that it would be found. I was sure it would. Lucy Islesbarrow is the most efficient and intelligent person. I'll say she is. She scares the life out of me. She's so devastatingly efficient. No man will ever dare marry that girl. Now, I wouldn't say that. I would have to be a special type of man, of course. Miss Marple brooded on this thought a moment. How is she getting on at Rutherford Hall? They're completely dependent on her as far as I can see, eating out of her hand, literally, as you might say. By the way, they know nothing about her connection with you. We've kept that dark. She has no connection now with me. She has done what I asked her to do. So you could hand in her notice and go if she wanted to. Yes, but she stops on. Why? She has not mentioned her reasons to me. She is a very intelligent girl. I suspect that she has become interested in the problem or in the family. It may be, said Miss Marple, that it is rather difficult to separate the two. Craddock looked hard at her. Oh, no. Oh, dear me, no. Have you got anything particular in mind? I think you have. Miss Marple shook her head. Dermot Craddock sighed. So all I can do is to prosecute my inquiries, to put it in jargon. A policeman's life is a dull one. You'll get results, I'm sure. Any ideas for me? More inspired guesswork? I was thinking of things like theatrical companies, said Miss Marple rather vaguely. Touring from place to place and perhaps not many home ties. One of those young women would be much less likely to be missed. Yes, perhaps you've got something there. We'll pay special attention to that angle, he added. What are you smiling about? I was just thinking, said Miss Marple, of Elspeth McGillicuddy's face when she hears we found the body. Well, said Mrs. McGillicuddy, well. Words failed her. She looked across at the nicely spoken, pleasant young man who had called upon her with official credentials, and then down at the photographer, at the photograph that he handed her. That's her, all right, she said. Yes, that's her. Poor soul. Well, I must say I'm glad you found her body. Nobody believed the word I said, the police or the railway people or anyone else. It's very galling not to be believed. At any rate, nobody could say I didn't do all I possibly could. The nice young man made sympathetic and appreciative noises. Where did you say the body was found? In the barn at a house called Rutherford Hall, just outside Brackhampton. Never heard of it. How did it get there, I wonder? The young man didn't reply. Jane Marple found it, I suppose. Trust Jane. The body, said the young man, referring to some notes, was found by a Miss Lucy Islesbarrow. Never heard of her either, said Mrs. McGillicuddy. I still think Jane Marple had something to do with it. Anyway, Mrs. McGillicuddy, you definitely identified this picture as that of a woman whom you saw in a train? Being strangled by a man, yes, I do. Now, can you describe this man? He was a tall man, said Mrs. McGillicuddy. Yes. And dark? Yes. That's all I can tell you, said Mrs. McGillicuddy. He had his back to me. I didn't see his face. Would you be able to recognize him if you saw him? Of course I shouldn't. He had his back to me. I never saw his face. You have no idea at all as to his age? Mrs. McGillicuddy considered. No, not really. I mean, I don't know. He wasn't, I'm almost sure, very young. His shoulders looked, well, set, if you know what I mean. The young man nodded. 30 and upward. I can't get closer than that. I wasn't really looking at him, you see. It was her, with those hands round her throat and her face, all blue, you know, something. Sometimes I dream of it even now. It must have been a distressing experience, said the young man sympathetically. He closed his notebook and said, When are you returning to England? Not for another 3 weeks. It isn't necessary, is it, for me? He quickly reassured her. Oh, no, there's nothing you could do at present. Of course, if we make an arrest, it was left like that. The mail brought a letter from Miss Marple to her friend. The writing was spiky and spidery and heavily underlined. Long practice made it easy for Mrs. McGillicuddy to decipher. Miss Marple wrote a very full account to her friend, who devoured every word with great satisfaction. She and Jane had shown them all right. 咁係一個好短嘅一個章節啦，其實就係主要就係講呢個Craddock 啦，就原來就走咗去揾呢個 Miss Marple 係啦，咁就即係話意味住佢哋係識得嘅嚇，之前都識得嘅，甚至乎係唔單止識得咁簡單啦，我覺得都即係我覺得係有少少接近朋友關係啦，因為睇佢哋嘅對話都幾都屬於深入嘅，主要係講關於呢一個 Marple 對 McGillicuddy 嘅一啲感覺啦，佢對佢嘅認知啦。咁當然係就係講 McGillicuddy 就係唔係一個傻嘅女人啦，佢係唔會自己喺度胡思亂想講啲嘢出嚟咁樣啦。佢係真係睇到個兇案發生嘅咁然之後咧就亦都交代咗佢哋都已經警方已經派咗人去印度去士蘭嗰度去對呢個 McGillicuddy 進行問話啦，咁樣攞一攞口供啦。咁之後就將嗰個故事就帶咗去士蘭啦，咁就揾咗個後生仔去問話啦。咁亦都好 casual 嘅啫咁當然亦都係再三問 McGillicuddy 有冇睇到兇手啦，因為其實呢個先係緊要啊嘛。咁但係呢度McGillicuddy 亦都再三確認咗係睇唔到。呢個唔係一個線索，同時間亦都係線索。唔係線索就係佢咩都睇唔到，係線索就係佢實際上係睇唔到，佢只不過係聲稱佢係一個男性，高可能佢話佢高瘦，咁就好 dark 嘅。佢冇佢瘦，佢話佢好 dark 咁就好高，咁同埋應該係30歲打上，因為佢話佢膊頭就有啲 set。咁但係實際上佢睇唔到佢樣嘅喎，佢純粹係因為佢好 dark 有啲高，咁就斷定咗佢係男性啦，咁樣，咁就因為高同埋 dark 就係男性，咁但係佢亦都睇唔到佢樣，咁呢個證供可唔可以當真呢？呢個就係問題啦。咁會唔會兇手假扮成一個類近男人嘅咁嘅身軀咧，嚟去防止一啲目擊人會聯想到佢其實唔係咧咁樣？呢個係我嘅猜測啦咁但係呢一度喺呢個章節，一個短短嘅章節就印證咗呢一個 point， 就係 Miss McGillicuddy 係真係睇唔到呢個兇手嘅。佢嘅形容就只能夠得咁多啦。咁呢一節就字數唔係好多啦，咁我就揾到一個字同大家分享嘅。呢個字其實都幾容易 估到啦。咁我自己本身就識得嘅呢個字 credential。咁呢個 credential 係點樣用嘅咧？就係、喺文中咧就會有講啦，就係呢個盤問呢一個 McGillicuddy 嘅呢個後生仔啊，就呼召咗佢出嚟啦，呼召咗 McGillicuddy 出嚟啦 ，with official credential 即係佢俾咗 McGillicuddy 呢個佢自己嘅身份證明啦。喺呢一個 case 咧 ，credential 嘅意思就係佢嘅身份證明咁 credential 除咗身份證明之外，仲有其他嘅用法嘅，即係譬如會話你嘅 qualification 啦，你嘅資歷啦，一啲資格啦，一啲可以表明到你身份嘅嘢啦，咁樣可以係一啲 achievement 啦，都得嘅credential。OK， 咁呢一節我就揾到呢個字同大家分享。咁我哋下一次11節再同大家見面，拜拜。